They called it a burglary, but it was something else entirely. By 1962, Robert Kennedy was starting to learn the rules of a game he hadn't even known he was playing. The Cold War was in full swing, and the CIA, barely a decade old, was already acting like a shadow state. They'd been running operations off the books since day one, keeping secrets even from the Oval Office. RFK, as Attorney General, thought he was in charge. He wasn't. Then he stumbled onto something he never should have seen. Operation Gladio. It didn't look like much at first. A whisper in a file, a loose end in a report. But what it traced back to was explosive. A decades-old covert operation that tied together the Italian-Mafia, Corsican gangsters, and the American mob. What began in the 1950s as an anti-communist strategy, arming underground networks in Europe in case of a Soviet invasion, morphed into a global criminal conspiracy. The result? Heroin. Lots of it. Flowing from the Middle East, refined in France, distributed by Sicilian and Corsican hands, and landing on American streets courtesy of La Cosa Nostra. It was the foundation of what would later be known as the French Connection. Kennedy had no idea what he was looking at in '62, but what he uncovered was the toxic afterbirth of a CIA alliance with mobsters that started back in 1951. The dominoes had been falling for years. He had just walked into the middle of the collapse. Meanwhile, back in New York. That same year, across the East River, a jewelry heist was quietly setting off alarms. It started like a routine smash and grab, the kind that gets a 2-inch column in the local crime blotter. But behind it was a tangle of ex-cons, securities stolen, and whispers of something much bigger. June 25th, 1960. Cartier's flagship store on Fifth Avenue, $30,000 worth of jewels gone in seconds. Display case shattered. A man disappears into the city. The NYPD and FBI didn't buy the simplicity. They started watching a suspect. Joseph Coffey, 23, out of Monroe Street. Ex-con. Reckless. Not a planner. But something about him fit. Cartier's night guard had caught a glimpse of the guy fleeing the scene, pulled his mug from a rogues gallery lineup. The feds came to the same conclusion independently. So they trailed him for 5 weeks. Coffey wasn't alone. Kingdon Bill de Normand, 51, Bronx resident, rode shotgun. A relic from the Dutch Schultz days, de Normand still dressed sharp and carried himself like he mattered. He had the look of a man who'd been around long enough to know where the bodies were buried, and maybe buried a few himself. On Tuesday night, 7 unmarked cars loaded with cops and feds tailed a blue and white 55 sedan as it crawled from the Lower East Side, across the Manhattan Bridge and into Brooklyn. They parked near the Paramount Theater, waiting for a fence who never showed. Suspicious, but patient, they followed the car back through the Battery Tunnel, up the East River Drive, and finally decided to make their move near 23rd Street. They hit pay dirt. De Normand had the jewels on him, tucked in a tiny bag behind a line of imported cigars. Classy touch. But that wasn't all. Back at the precinct, detectives opened the bag and found a little bonus. $25,000 in Canadian mining securities and AT&T stock certificates. Leftovers from 2 other burglaries in Queens, one at A. Deutscher's hardware firm on July 28th, the other at Harry Herman Plumbing the following night. Non-negotiable, sure, but valuable enough to catch the FBI's eye. Coffey was booked for burglary, de Normand for criminal possession. Both held without bail, though Coffey made general sessions on $4 grand. A third man, Juan Patsy Fuca, 27, also from Monroe Street, was picked up later near his apartment. He was the suspected wheelman, but the cops couldn't prove it. They charged him with vagrancy and set bail at $500. What looked like a clean jewel job turned out to be the tail end of something messier. 3 small-time crooks bumping up against a larger machine. Whether they knew it or not, they were on the periphery of something international, something hidden in plain sight. Heroin, guns, intelligence operations, and a government that no longer knew where its own operations ended and the underworld began. Fast forward 18 months. January 1962. Brooklyn. 3 NYPD detectives, Egan, Grosso, and Aviletta, had been working something much bigger. An international dope ring. Long shadows led back to France, Marseille, Corsica, Sicilian ports. They'd been watching a run-down tenement with fresh plaster in the basement ceiling. When they broke it open, they didn't just find heroin. They found a war. 22 packages of pure heroin, each weighing over a kilo. Guns, ammunition, a Japanese submachine gun. The heroin alone was worth $3.5 million, the biggest single narcotic seizure in New York history. And it hadn't come in by air. It came in style, smuggled aboard a French luxury liner, straight into the Brooklyn docks. At the center of it, the same man who walked away from the Cartier case, Patsy Fuqua. This time they got him. And they got his father, his wife, his brother. Alongside them, Jacques Angelvin, a TV personality from Marseille posing as a nightclub entertainer, and François Scalia, alias Barbier, from Paris. The Canadians tipped them off. Montreal had been their staging ground. That heroin trail led straight back to Operation Gladio, a Cold War black op turned rogue. What began in the 1950s as a covert NATO-backed effort to prepare for Soviet invasion had twisted into something else. Networks of stay-behind operatives, ex-fascists, mobsters, Corsican gangsters turned their war tools into global business. The business was heroin, and the American mob was all in. Robert Kennedy in 1962 had no idea what he was standing in. As Attorney General, he'd thought he was fighting organized crime. But what he found was deeper. The CIA had partnered with criminals to move product, fund operations, and fight communism by any means necessary. But the money never stayed clean, and the heroin didn't stop at foreign ports. It came home. It hit Harlem. It hit the Bronx. It hit soldiers returning from Korea. And it all started with a smash and grab on Fifth Avenue. What RFK stumbled across in '62 wasn't just a case file. It was the American end of an international operation that began in 1951, spanned 3 continents, and funneled war, politics, and heroin through the same dark pipeline. The Cartier job was just a flare. The fire behind it was something else entirely. The heroin was in the ceiling. By 1962, the diamonds were old news. The Cartier job had cracked open a door. Behind it was something far darker than stolen jewels and busted display glass. This wasn't about Joseph Coffey anymore. It wasn't even about Kingdon de Normand. That was street level, a distraction. The real action was in the ceiling of a tenement in Brooklyn, January 18, 1962. Federal agents and NYPD narco squads hit 245 7th Street near the Gowanus Canal. A 3-story walk-up. Nothing special from the outside, but inside, in a ground-floor apartment occupied by Joseph Fuqua, 60, they saw something that didn't belong. Fresh plaster in the ceiling of the basement. They dug in. What they found wasn't just a cache. It was a monument. 22 tightly packed bricks of pure, uncut heroin, each weighing over a kilo. Total street value, $3.5 million. The biggest dope haul in New York history. Hidden farther back in the ceiling, a Japanese submachine gun, a .30 caliber rifle, a shotgun, and boxes of ammo. War weapons in a Brooklyn basement. Not a coincidence. Joseph was shirtless when they grabbed him. He'd been caught mid-move. His son, Pasquale Patsy Fuqua, 31, was also arrested, along with Barbara Fuqua, Patsy's 19-year-old wife. They lived with their 2 kids, at 1224 67th Street and ran a luncheonette in Bushwick. But Patsy wasn't flipping burgers. He was moving wholesale heroin by the kilo. Police said he wasn't a user, he was a boss. More arrests came within hours. In Midtown Manhattan, at a hotel near Old Slip, federal agents took down Jacques Angelvin, 35, a slick French entertainer from Marseille with his own TV show, and François Scalia, 43, of Paris, a producer. One ran a bistro, the other had charm and stage presence. They also had heroin. The dope came in on the liner United States, concealed in hidden compartments of Angelvin's 1960 Buick, shipped from Le Havre. Angelvin had checked into the Waldorf Astoria, parked the car in a garage, and never touched it for 5 days. He didn't have to. Surveillance picked up Scalia and another French associate, Jean Jehan, freezing outside Pier 88, waiting for the car to be unloaded. Once it was out, the Frenchmen vanished into Manhattan, but they were already being followed. Assistant District Attorney Frank Baumann built the timeline like a slow-burning fuse. January 4th, Angelvin leaves Rouen. January 5th, he sails for New York. January 8th, Scalia lands in Montreal. January 10th, the car arrives in New York. January 15th, it's moved to a new garage and tampered with. January 18th, the bust. When the Fucus were taken in, they were sitting on the stash. The auto, when later searched, had heroin traces hidden in rocker panels and splash guards. It had been rigged for smuggling. Another blue suitcase connected to Angelvin was traced to a handoff made to Patsy Fuca several blocks from the garage. Every part of the pipeline was confirmed. In court, Angelvin played the showman. His lawyer called him the Jack Parr of France. He said he'd explain why a French TV host would ship a Buick across the Atlantic for a 10-day trip at a cost of $475. The courtroom waited. There was no explanation. Meanwhile, Scalia was indicted on narcotics charges. Angelvin was held as a material witness, then indicted on 3 counts: conspiracy, smuggling, and intent to distribute. Prosecutors tied him to 23 pounds of uncut heroin, the entire ceiling stash. The state called it an international narcotics conspiracy, built on French suppliers, Canadian staging grounds, and Brooklyn distribution. The smuggling operation, Baumann said, had Parisian flavor and American muscle. But there was one more name. Joseph Fuca, father of Patsy, arrested shirtless at the bust, had already had a run-in with the law just weeks earlier. He'd been fined $100 for running an illegal gambling operation. Pool selling. Nothing major. But it showed what the family business really was. Whatever made money. Dice, diamonds, heroin. No moral code, just logistics. In one move, the city had taken down its largest heroin distributor, cracked a Franco-American pipeline, and unearthed the US end of a global conspiracy that had been running silent for years. What began as a jewel robbery on Fifth Avenue now looked like an early chapter in something far bigger. It was never just a burglary, it was a signal. Behind the broken window at Cartier's was a trail that led to war stockpiles, to French ports, to CIA ghosts, to narcotics with NATO fingerprints, and to addicts in Harlem holding needles filled with foreign policy fallout. RFK had just started reading the file. The rest of the country didn't even know the book existed. America wasn't just founded. It was built, engineered by industrial titans, banking dynasties, and holy men with dirty hands. By the 1950s, you couldn't tell the difference between a corporate executive and a boss. One wore a collar, one wore a ring, but they both answered to the same God: power. Corruption wasn't a side effect of the system, it was the system. Organized crime wasn't an underworld, it was the infrastructure. Church pews, boardrooms, and backroom deals in D.C. all blurred into the same thing. A priest might work with the mob like it was communion, because to some of these men, the mafia was religion, and religion was the mafia. The world had barely finished bleeding from World War II when the real game began. The old empires were dead or dying, Britain, France, Spain, and what was left had to be carved up. America, fresh off the battlefield and flush with cash, was the only player left with the muscle to claim the table. But this wasn't going to be about tanks and troops anymore. This was a new kind of war. Nuclear weapons had changed the rules. Intelligence was the new front line. Behind it all, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, laid the groundwork. They weren't just spies. They were diplomats, fixers, gangsters, and Wall Street brokers rolled into one. They knew how the British did it. MI6 had been manipulating foreign governments since the colonies. Now, the Americans were learning fast. The Cold War was a perfect cover story. Democracy, freedom. That was the PR campaign. What they were really selling was control. Control of oil, control of bananas, control of copper mines and canal zones, control of people. If a foreign government nationalized a resource, say oil in Iran or bananas in Guatemala, that was seen as theft. And the men running American industry didn't ask for it back. They sent the CIA. The fear was simple and real, that Soviet-backed regimes would do what the Bolsheviks did, overthrow the capitalists and build communist strongholds on American investment. It was about protecting assets. And those assets stretched from Central America to the Middle East to Southeast Asia. In Europe after the war, everything was rubble. American loans rebuilt it, but they came with strings. Strings long enough to turn nations into puppets. The US didn't just help rebuild Europe. It owned it. And if any of those countries leaned too far left, toward Moscow, toward socialism, there was already a plan in place to handle it. In Asia, after the partition of India, Pakistan moved into a tight alliance with Saudi Arabia and, by extension, with the United States. Now America had a foothold near China, Afghanistan, and a rising communist India. The global board was taking shape. By the early 1950s, Truman had banned the CIA from running covert operations. He said America didn't need a Gestapo, but the CIA found a way in. Money talks and drug money screams. Opium profits, foreign cash, off-the-books deals. The CIA used that to grease the gears. When the Soviets tested their first nuclear weapon, Truman folded. He greenlit the CIA, and the man who took the reins was Allen Dulles. Dulles was more than a bureaucrat. He was plugged in. He had ties to Wall Street, to European royalty, and to a man named Sam Zemurray, better known as Sam the Banana Man. Zemurray ran United Fruit. At one point, he was the richest man in America. He wasn't just selling fruit. He was flipping governments. United Fruit owned the tropics. And if a local regime didn't play ball, Sam would send in the Marines or call in the CIA. This wasn't unusual. It was how things worked. Latin America was an American playground. Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, Jamaica. Most of them were already in America's back pocket. Brazil was next. Cuba was handled. And it wasn't just land they controlled. It was blood. Minerals, oil, railroads, bananas, sugar. If it made money, it was protected like a crown jewel. And behind all of it was a class of men who never ran for office, but ruled like kings. Names you know, names you don't. Some were public, some like the shadows. But they shaped your life, whether you noticed or not. They decided what you ate, what you paid at the pump, whether your paycheck kept up with the cost of living. They were the boardroom emperors, the real government, not congressmen or presidents. Those were window dressing. The real power belonged to the DuPonts, Henry Ford, Sam Zimuri, Harvey Firestone, the Weyerhaeuser lumber dynasty, Swift and Company, the Astors, Walter Gifford of AT&T, David Sarnoff at RCA, George F. Baker of First National Bank, Andrew Mellon, J.P. Morgan, the Whitneys, the Harrimans, the Guggenheims, the McCormicks, Arthur Curtis James, Stanley Dollar, Myron C. Taylor, Edward Berwind, Floyd Odlum, the Lehman Brothers, Frederick Prince. These were the men who shaped the American century, the titans behind the curtain, some built for the common good, some built for themselves, but all of them pulled the strings of empire. And when the world shifted, when the old guards fell and the map got redrawn, they didn't mourn. They bought the pieces. Because they didn't just run companies, they ran countries. The greatest collectivist farming operation the world has ever seen wasn't in Stalin's Russia. It was in the tropics, run by an American corporation and a guy born in Bessarabia named Sam Zimuri. His name wouldn't ring out like Rockefeller or Carnegie, but in 9 countries across the Caribbean and Latin America, he was king. United Fruit Company. On paper, a fruit business. In reality, a multinational syndicate with more real power than most small nations. They had nearly 1 million acres under their control. Jamaica, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, Costa Rica. Farms, radio stations, airstrips, railroads, commissaries, power plants, hospitals, laboratories, hotels. Hell, they even had their own snake venom lab. And when a president down there got out of line, United Fruit had a way of suggesting he might prefer Paris to a firing squad at home. They didn't start that big. The company began with just $20 million in capital. But it ballooned to $200 million and paid out $250 million in dividends over the years. They weren't just selling bananas. They were running a government. Or more accurately, several. By the early 20th century, they were operating 2,250 miles of railroad and a merchant fleet bigger than some countries' navies, 65 steamships flying under the Great White Fleet banner. They moved 1.3 million tons of cargo a year, 60,000 passengers, and their stock was held by more than 30,000 Americans, most of them women. In a bad year, they still paid out $8.7 million in dividends. The power wasn't theoretical. It was boots-on-the-ground control. They employed over 70,000 workers, 50,000 of them local laborers. The company paid out $18 million in wages, and then sold those same workers $6.5 million in U.S. goods through its own stores. The money came in, and it circled right back out. Every mozo and machete swing farmhand had shoes, meat on the table, and access to modern hospitals. That wasn't philanthropy. That was policy. Bananas bought stability. And if Marines kept things tidy with boots and bullets, bananas built the foundation. Roads, trade, steady pay, fewer revolutions. Not because people were happy, because they were too busy working. Bananas weren't even part of the American diet 100 years ago. They arrived by accident. In 1870, a Cape Cod sea captain named Lorenzo Dow Baker stopped off in Jamaica to buy bamboo. He got a rum punch at the bar and walked out with a few bunches of bananas, bought at 25 cents each. 11 days later in New York, he sold them 10 times that. He got the message. By 1885, Baker teamed up with another sea dog and a commission salesman named Andrew W. Preston. Together, they launched the Boston Fruit Company. A few years later, they merged with a railroad man from Costa Rica, Miner Keith, who had been laying track through Central America, 1 corpse per rail tie, if you believe the legends. He planted bananas along the rails to generate traffic. By the 1880s, he was shipping millions of stems. By 1899, Boston Fruit and Keith's operation merged. United Fruit was born. Preston became president. Keith built the empire. Captain Baker went home, built a hotel, and told war stories to anyone who'd listen. Preston ran the company like a general. Tight discipline, big vision, and an instinct for the tropics. He expanded fleets, pushed into new territory, and made sure the executives were cutthroat men of action, not Ivy League daydreamers. The dividends showed it. Stock payouts doubled, then tripled. In the roaring 20s, they cut a 250% dividend for every share, no par value. Then came the crash. By 1931, the Depression had kicked the teeth out of the banana trade. People couldn't afford apples, let alone bananas. United Fruit's stock bottomed out at $10.25 a share. That's when the wild card walked back into the game. Sam Zemurray. They called him Sam the Banana Man. Born in Bessarabia, came to New York at 11, peddled fruit off a pushcart, and made his first fortune down south dealing bananas out of Mobile and New Orleans. He was smart, he was sharp, and he had guts. In 1910, Zemurray financed a revolution in Honduras. Put ex-President Bonilla back in power. Bonilla gave him land, ports, rail concessions, everything he asked for. Zemurray built the Cuyamel Fruit Company and made life miserable for United Fruit. Eventually, they bought him out for 300,000 shares, worth about $20 million. Zemurray retired at 53. I bought a mansion in Louisiana, lived easily, until 1931, when he saw his stock slipping with the rest of the market. He didn't like it. So, in 1932, he walked into the United Fruit boardroom with a stack of proxies and stock certificates. He didn't ask for power, he took it. He had enough votes to force change. And he made a move. He demanded control. I wanted to run operations. I wanted to slash the fat and take back the company's edge. The board blinked. He got what he wanted. Zemurray's first act was to cut $50 million off the books in property valuations, just to save on depreciation. Then he hit the field, traveling across every inch of the United Fruit empire, firing dead weight, cleaning house. He axed a quarter of the execs. 2 weeks later, the stock price shot up to $26. He didn't care if a man drank. He didn't care if he gambled. He cared if he produced. If you delivered results, you were in. If you didn't, you were out. College degrees meant nothing. He wanted banana men. Men who knew how to survive in the jungle and make money doing it. In January 1933, the president of United Fruit resigned. There was nothing left for him to do. Zemurray had the wheel. They gave him the title, executive head of operations, the real power, the throne. He kept the old president on as a figurehead, just to keep things polite. From that point on, United Fruit was Zemurray. No one knew how much stock he controlled. It didn't matter. He ran the show. He built an empire out of fruit and firepower. He stabilized governments with shipping schedules, and he ruled like an emperor of Banana Land, an admiral of the Great White Fleet. If United Fruit was an empire, then Sullivan and Cromwell was its Vatican. The firm didn't just handle legal paperwork. They built the legal machinery that let United Fruit function like a shadow government. By the 1910s, Sullivan and Cromwell was already deep inside United Fruit's world, drafting land deals, navigating international law, building tax shelters, and brokering the kind of concessions that turned entire countries into company property. These weren't farms. They were fiefdoms. Thousands of acres, radio towers, private airstrips, company stores, railroads, power stations, hospitals, laboratories, hotels. In Central America, it was easier to name what wasn't owned by United Fruit. And it wasn't just about bananas. Out in the far reaches of United Fruit's empire, where the law didn't reach and oversight was a fantasy, the land was used for more than fruit. Opium, coca, heroin, cannabis. The same infrastructure that moved bananas could just as easily move drugs, cash, bribes, and people. Railroads moved the product. Airstrips got it out fast. The jungle was thick, the laws were thin, and the money was unreal. The company ran radio stations across its territories, not for music, but for control. If a coup went down, the story was theirs to tell. If a leader was assassinated, they had the narrative ready. Suspect, motive, justification, all on the airwaves within the hour. When you control the message, you control the truth. This was happening before the CIA even existed. And when the CIA did come into the picture, they found the blueprint already in place. United Fruit was the prototype. A corporation running a covert empire with plausible deniability and private infrastructure. It was ready-made for intelligence work, and Sullivan and Cromwell made sure none of it broke the rules, on paper. They handled the tax games, they handled the loopholes. They made sure United Fruit could operate tax efficiently while locking down monopolies on ports, railroads, and land. They weren't just advising on law, they were writing it, negotiating it, shaping it in boardrooms across the hemisphere. Exploitation was cleaned up with legal language. Theft became concession rights. Political meddling became crisis management. In the 1930s and 40s, a senior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell started handling the contracts personally. His name was John Foster Dulles. He would later become Secretary of State. And in those contracts, he made sure United Fruit got what it wanted, whether it was favorable land deals or legal immunity in the face of political unrest. At the same time, his younger brother Alan Dulles was rising in the intelligence world. Eventually, he would become the head of the CIA. By the 1950s, the Dulles brothers were running US foreign policy, and their old client United Fruit had problems. In Guatemala, President Jacobo Arbenz was moving to nationalize unused land, including vast holdings that United Fruit had been sitting on. That land wasn't being used, but it was still on the books, and United Fruit wasn't going to give it up without a fight. So, Sullivan and Cromwell reframed the issue. Arbenz wasn't just a local reformer anymore. He was suddenly a communist threat. That narrative clicked perfectly into the Cold War playbook. And now, United Fruit's fight to protect its land became America's fight to stop the red tide. Alan Dulles, as CIA director, signed off on Operation PB Success, a covert operation to overthrow Arbenz. It worked. The president was gone. A new regime was in place. United Fruit kept its land, and Sullivan and Cromwell kept the files clean. It wasn't just legal representation. It was a full-spectrum influence campaign, from Wall Street to the White House to the jungle. The same men negotiating contracts were crafting foreign policy. The Dulles brothers weren't public servants. They were corporate agents with badges. By the time it was over, United Fruit had become a model for how American corporate power and US intelligence could work hand in hand. It didn't matter if the product was bananas, oil, or narcotics. The playbook was the same. Get the land, control the infrastructure, shape the narrative, protect the investment. And if someone got in the way, change the regime, change the story, call it freedom. In 1951, the CIA lit a match that would burn across Europe for the next 40 years. The name was Operation Gladio. On the surface, a stay-behind network meant to fight the Soviets if World War III kicked off. But that was just the cover story. Gladio was never about defense. It was about control. Washington had learned the hard way. Democracies were messy. Voters could turn left, swing right, or worse, elect socialists. The American solution wasn't to influence elections. It was to control the people who ran them, politicians, newspapers, journalists, even the unions. And to keep their own fingerprints off the dirty work, they outsourced the muscle. The mob did the wet work. The CIA kept its hands clean. Gladio stocked weapons caches all over Western Europe, in basements, in barns, in churches, in caves. Secret armies were trained, armed, and told to wait. On paper, they were a resistance force against the Red Army. But what they were really built for was domestic manipulation. bribery, blackmail, bombings, kidnappings, assassinations. All off the books, all under the radar. And here's the twist. The people the CIA armed to fight communism were the same people the Soviets had just defeated in the last war. The Nazis. After World War II, the lines got blurry fast. Fascists who survived the Nuremberg hangings got new jobs protecting Western democracy. In Italy, the Mafia, once tied to socialist roots, pivoted fast. They teamed up with the American government and with their Italian-American cousins in New York and Chicago. From there, the network spread into Corsica, Marseille, into the French Connection and the heroin routes. In places like Belgium and Switzerland, where the Mafia didn't run deep, the CIA trained actual fascists instead. Real-deal brown shirts with new suits and new roles. The operation expanded. Everyone in the network had two things in common: anti-communism and ties to organized crime. And it worked. Wherever Gladio ran, chaos followed by control. Assassinations were pinned on communists. Bombings sparked fear. Fear turned into support for the right. The mob got stronger. The agency got plausible deniability. And American business interests got everything they wanted. Iran, 1953. They called it Operation Ajax. The target: Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist who had the audacity to take back Iran's oil from the British. Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, today's BP, and both London and Washington lost their minds. So, Allen Dulles sent in the CIA propaganda. Street mobs, bribes, agitators, CIA officers handed out cash in suitcases and incited riots. Newspapers were bought, politicians were bought, the army was bought. By August, the Shah was back in power. Mossadegh was out. For 25 years, Iran became a client state, a dictatorship wearing a Western suit. American companies got the oil, the Shah got the throne, and the mob got the keys to the kingdom. Meyer Lansky was one of the first in. Casinos, money laundering, real estate deals in Tehran, car import-export rackets with exclusive contracts, oil shipping, arms movement, laundered millions, washed through clean hotels and crooked deals. Iran was open for business, mob business, and it stayed that way until 1979, when the Shah fell and the revolution set fire to the whole arrangement. But by then, Lansky and company had already moved on. Guatemala, 1954. Same playbook, different continent. President Jacobo Arbenz wanted to break up unused land and give it to the people. But that land belonged to United Fruit. And United Fruit belonged to the boardrooms of Wall Street and the backrooms of Washington. Allen Dulles called it a threat, not to democracy, to business. And once again, the CIA came knocking. Propaganda, sabotage, bribes, and covert warfare. But this time, the operation wasn't just political, it was personal. The muscle behind the campaign included two names that would echo in American history: David Ferry, Jack Ruby. Ferry, pilot, mob courier, ex-Capuchin priest turned intelligence asset. A man with more secrets than friends. Ruby, mobbed-up nightclub owner, bagman, and future assassin of the assassin. Connected to Chicago, New Orleans, Dallas. Deep in the Southern Syndicate. They were part of the same underworld network that helped topple Arbenz, the same one that benefited when Guatemala was thrown back into the hands of U.S. corporate interests. The Dulles brothers ran the show. Allen in the CIA, John Foster in the State Department. Sullivan and Cromwell tied it all together. And behind them, bankrolling, laundering, supplying, stood organized crime. This wasn't about freedom, it was about control. And the mob was all in. Before the CIA, before Gladio, before coups were being cooked up in boardrooms and back alleys, it started with produce, with bananas, with ships, with New Orleans, 1893. The United Fruit Company, along with its rival, Standard Fruit Steamship, was already building an empire across Central America. But they needed muscle in the States. Muscle that could move product off the docks, shake down unions, eliminate competition, and make sure nothing got slowed up between the ships and the streets. They turned to Charles Matranga. Matranga wasn't just another immigrant hustler. He was the boss of what would become the New Orleans crime family, one of the oldest mafia outfits in the country. 2 years earlier, in 1891, a lynch mob slaughtered 11 Italian men in New Orleans in what became the largest mass lynching in U.S. history. Matranga survived. FDR himself once said it was a good thing. The rest of the country might have looked the other way, but United Fruit saw something else: opportunity. They brought Matranga in. And from that moment on, for the next 50 years, United Fruit and the New Orleans Mafia were in business. Literally. The company controlled land and logistics from Guatemala to Colombia. The Matranga crew made sure the goods hit U.S. markets smooth. No strikes, no hijackings, no questions. It wasn't a handshake. It was a full-blown partnership. When Charles Matranga died, his protege took over, Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carollo, another powerhouse figure with old-school roots and new-school connections. He expanded the syndicate across Louisiana, Mississippi, and deep into Central America. Carollo kept the pipeline open. Fruit, narcotics, labor, whatever United Fruit needed to move, he moved it. By the 1930s, United Fruit wasn't just a banana company. It controlled 40% of Guatemala and massive tracts in Honduras, Colombia, Panama. It owned the ports. It owned the rail lines. And when did a government got in the way? That was handled, sometimes with bribes, sometimes with bullets. If labor needed to be replaced, Matranga's network shipped in workers from Italy, Sicily, or whatever corner of the globe was poor and desperate enough to take the job. If trouble showed up at the docks, the New Orleans crew crushed it. Fast. By the 1940s and into the 50s, Guatemala was heating up. Land reform, leftist politicians, calls for redistribution. United Fruit's grip was slipping. But so was the stability in New Orleans. Old rivalries were resurfacing. Blood started spilling. December 29th. William Bailey, known hijacker, took 14 shotgun blasts to the body outside a house on Governor Nichols Street. It was classic mob justice. Police suspected revenge for crossing the wrong people in the liquor rackets. Bailey bled out at the hospital, but not before naming his shooter, Silvestro Carollo. The press went wild. Capone, guns, gangland revenge. Al Capone, it turned out, was already in bed with the New Orleans mob. While the Florida Midwest liquor pipeline was drying up, Capone had opened a distillery in British Honduras, Belize, and rerouted shipments through the Louisiana coast. It was clean, quiet, perfect. Capone's trucks rolled north. His men worked the ports. His people ran with the Carollo crew, who now oversaw smuggling on both land and sea. It wasn't just moonshine anymore. It was high-level international liquor trafficking, Prohibition's last gasp. In early 1930s raids, agents uncovered everything. A pirate radio station communicating with rum runners in the Gulf. A fleet of armed trucks running cargoes from the marshes inland. Guns used in bank robberies, stashed in pool halls. Marijuana hidden in bedrooms. Shells matching the Whitney bank shooting. The Dallau brothers arrested. Witnesses killed or disappeared. They tracked it all back to a massive operation. 104 indictments. Men from New York, Chicago, Vancouver, Belize, Montreal, Kiln, Mississippi, all named. One name stood out: Silvestro Carollo. And another, Frank Todaro, Carollo's partner, future boss, and the man who would keep the New Orleans Mafia alive through the 1940s. The feds said the ring had operated for years. They even had their own fleet. Liquor bought in Canada, funneled to Belize, rerouted into Louisiana marshes, and smuggled into the heartland. The organization was deep, protected, armed, and backed by big money and political muscle. But here's what mattered. United Fruit kept moving cargo. The mob got paid. Capone used the same routes to run booze that the CIA would one day use to run arms. This wasn't just organized crime. It was organized power. And it all started with bananas. Charles Matranga was the old Don of New Orleans. He survived the 1891 lynchings, the largest mass lynching in American history, when 11 Italian men were dragged out of jail and executed by a mob. It sent a message to every immigrant in the city. You're not welcome here. The newspapers celebrated it. Even FDR called it a good thing. But Matranga walked away from it. And he didn't forget. He laid low, rebuilt, and by 1893, his operation was reborn, this time with backing. That year, United Fruit Company and Standard Fruit Steamship reached out. They needed someone who could run the docks, handle labor, and enforce silence. They found him. And for the next 50 years, Charles Matranga was more than a crime boss. He was an asset, a partner. The unofficial port authority of the Gulf. Bananas, rum, opium, heroin, it didn't matter. If it came through New Orleans, Matranga's boys touched it. And they got it where it needed to go. When Charles died, he left the empire in the hands of a killer, Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carollo. He was younger, tougher, and more connected. Sam had been working under Matranga for years. But with prohibition in full swing, things were about to explode. This was the moment the underworld became nationalized. The New Orleans crew linked up with Capone in Chicago, Luciano and Costello in New York, and Trafficante in Florida. A criminal superstructure was forming, and Carollo made sure New Orleans had a seat at the table. Forget the myth about Capone being chased out of Louisiana. That's garbage. Capone had properties in New Orleans. He spent money there. He built connections there. And he was protected by them. Carollo and Frank Todaro, another rising figure in the Matranga family, served as the Southern Syndicate's bridge to the national network. They helped coordinate shipments from Central America, secured routes through the Gulf, and plugged New Orleans into the national syndicate. Fruit, booze, dope, cash, it all moved through Louisiana. These weren't just gangsters. They were logistical masterminds. United Fruit owned the plantations. The mob moved the product. If a government got in the way, they replaced it. If labor got unruly, they brought in new workers, shipped in from Italy, or wherever the economy was desperate enough to say yes. One of Matranga's earliest partners was Corrado Giaccona, a respected wine merchant in the quarter with deep ties to the old country. But in 1908, his name hit the front page, caught in a triple homicide that had all the trademarks of a vendetta hit. 3 men, Giovanni and Nunzi Baracca and Ciro Cusimano, were shot to death in Giaccona's home. Another, Francisco Vatali, was found bleeding out under a shed, clutching a raw chicken to his wound. The Giacconas claimed self-defense, said it was extortion, claimed they were protecting their family from Black Hand shakedowns. The crime scene looked more like a battlefield. Dead men slumped on the gallery stairs, bullet holes in the banisters, blood smeared through the garden. A repeating rifle, a shotgun, an automatic pistol, all fired. Detectives found shell casings embedded in walls, bullet holes barely 2 feet from the floor. Most of the shots were taken close. Personal. The elder Giaccona took the blame, claimed he fired all 6 shots himself, but investigators didn't buy it. Too many weapons. Too many holes. Corrado, his son, cracked under questioning, confessed there were 4 visitors that night, only 2 of whom they knew. Claimed the 4th man, Vatali, pulled a gun first. The official story: they were tired of being blackmailed, tired of being bled dry. tired of giving up $50, $100 at a time just to be left alone. One of the dead men had even made Giacomo pay for his wedding and furniture. The local Italian community rallied behind the Giaconos. Lawrence Federico, president of the Italian Vigilance Committee, offered $50,000 bail. Others promised $250,000 if needed. They said it wasn't murder. It was justice. In the end, the charges faded. No conviction, no time served. But the message was clear. These weren't farmers and shopkeepers anymore. They were enforcers, architects of a new kind of power, quiet, economic, and violent when necessary. Giacomo's name would mostly vanish from the press, but his protégés didn't. Frank Todaro and Silver Dollar Sam picked up the torch. They expanded. They linked with the Galliano crew in New York, Trafficante in Tampa, and Carlos Marcello in Texas. From Louisiana to Las Vegas, they built the distribution network the modern Mafia would run on. New Orleans wasn't a satellite anymore. It was a hub. And it started with Charles Matranga, the old god, surviving a lynching and turning a fruit company into a criminal empire. By 1944, the old guard of New Orleans was fading out. Charles Matranga was dead. Corrado Giacomo followed, buried that same year. What was left behind wasn't a void, it was an empire, and someone had to take the throne. That someone was Carlos Marcello. It didn't happen overnight. First came Silver Dollar Sam Carollo, the bridge between the old Sicilian code and the new American hustle. He was slick, smart, and built like a man who'd survived too many betrayals to ever flinch again. He knew how to make the phone ring in Havana, New York, or Palermo and get whatever he wanted. But even he saw the game was changing. The unions were now gold mines. Narcotics? Exploding. Gambling. Embedded in every city block from Canal Street to Dallas. So Carollo and Frank Todaro went looking for someone new, someone colder, hungrier, and American enough to play with the big boys. That's when Marcello stepped in. A streetwise gangster with Sicilian roots and Louisiana muscle, he was already building a shadow empire, using real estate, union rackets, and muscle to take over everything the old dons left behind. By 1947, Carlos Marcello wasn't just running the show. He was the show. From Jefferson Parish to Baton Rouge, from the French Quarter to the Dallas Strip, he made deals with political bosses and criminal overlords like he was setting the dinner table. And that table was long. Mobsters from New York, Chicago, Philly, Florida, and even Havana pulled up a chair. One of them was Jack Ruby, a small-time operator with big-time connections to the Chicago outfit and the Jewish underworld. Ruby had history. He was queer, volatile, and plugged in. He didn't just move guns. He moved people. People like David Ferry and people with clearance badges. Together, Marcello and Ruby turned Dallas into a new staging ground. A logistics hub for guns, drugs, and cash. They smuggled arms through New Orleans and got bodies in and out of Cuba, Sicily, wherever they were needed. This was deep tradecraft masked as street hustle, a flow of cargo that looked like bananas on paper, but traveled with silencers, heroin, and blackmail folded into the crates. The feds saw it, and they saw who was leading it. Marcello was convicted in 1938 for pushing weed, a year and a day in Atlanta. His brother Vincent was hit with him. In 1939, the IRS filed a $76,800 tax lien against them. But that's where the trail ends. Records? Gone. Local collectors claimed ignorance. Washington stonewalled. Nobody could say if Marcello paid the debt, negotiated it down, or just walked away. Carollo, same deal. 4 liens in 1945, totaling $62,024. Everyone discharged by March 1946. This guy had been convicted 3 times: bootlegging, narcotics, attempted murder. got a governor's pardon like it was lunch. The feds tried to deport him in 1936, called him an undesirable alien. But Congressman Jimmy Morrison, one of those grinning, backslapping politicos from Baton Rouge, kept him in the country with a string of private bills. When the government finally kicked him out in 1947, he was back in New Orleans by July 1950. No passport, no papers. Just a nod from Lucky Luciano, who wanted his narcotics man back in position on the Gulf. These were not rumors. These were records. But nobody could find out how the tax cases ended. So, a journalist pushed the issue. He got in front of Alvin Cross, Deputy Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Cross had 2 decades in the department, a lifer. These guys served time, the reporter said. One's been in Atlanta, the other's been deported. Why can't the public know how they settled with the IRS? Cross didn't blink. Doesn't make a difference, he said. The law is clear. We can't publish tax returns or settlements. But they're not average taxpayers. These guys used political influence to stay out of prison and dodge deportation. How do we know they didn't use that same influence to settle their taxes? Cross shrugged. That's how Congress wrote it. The law was designed to protect honest taxpayers, the ones who paid on time and didn't need lawyers or fixers. But even when a tax lien became public, even when the government put it on record that a gangster owed the Treasury 6 figures, what happened next was still sealed. Who makes the final call? The journalist asked. Who decides whether they pay in full or get a deal? The Secretary of the Treasury, Cross said. That decision doesn't come from a local office. It doesn't come from us. It goes straight to the top. He opened his desk and handed over a copy of the department's disclosure rules. It was stamped, tight, locked down. If you're asking whether a politician can reach into Treasury and shave a deal for someone like Carollo or Marcello, Cross said, the answer is, you'll never know. Not unless Congress changes the law. And that's the punchline. Marcello and Carollo weren't just crime bosses. They were case studies in how the American system protected power, no matter where it came from. Mobsters with political muscle, tax criminals with federal insulation, deportees with return tickets written by organized crime's top brass. They weren't just in business with American interests. They were embedded in the infrastructure. And nobody, not a judge, not a jury, not even the press, could pull the curtain back. By 1959, the dominoes that would eventually fall in Dealey Plaza were already lined up. The spark. Fidel Castro. When Castro took Havana, he didn't just evict Batista. He detonated a chain reaction that rattled Washington, the mob, the exile community, and every shadow network in between. A communist government in the Western Hemisphere wasn't just a political problem. It was personal. It was financial. It was existential. Suddenly, everyone had skin in the game. The CIA, Cuban exiles, right-wing oilmen, and mob bosses were all pushed into the same corner. Havana had gone red. The casinos were closed. The money dried up. And everyone who'd bet on Batista was left with blood on their chips. The web of players who would orbit John F. Kennedy's assassination. Most of them were in Cuba in '59. Washington had tried to have it both ways with Cuba since 1898. After helping kick out the Spanish, the U.S. wrote itself into Cuba's future through the Platt Amendment. It gave America the right to intervene whenever it pleased, usually in the name of stability or debt collection. When President Ramon Grau tried to tear that up in 1933, the U.S. sent in Ambassador Sumner Welles, who helped engineer a coup that installed a young army officer named Fulgencio Batista. Batista stepped down in '44, then came roaring back in '52 to overthrow an elected government. And just like that, Cuba was for sale again. But in the 1950s, the opposition to Batista wasn't just one group. It was a hydra. Castro's 26th of July movement was the face, but other cells were just as bloody. The Revolutionary Directorate tried to kill Batista outright in a failed 1957 assault on the presidential palace. Behind them, Carlos Marcello, Batista's predecessor, now in exile in Miami, and bankrolling revolution with a vengeance. Marcello claimed he gave Castro $125,000. He might as well have lit it on fire. The American government, its businessmen and its gangsters, all tried to hold Batista in power. It didn't work. And when Castro took over, they pivoted. Fast. Mobsters had ruled Havana's nightlife, the casinos, the press. They'd built broadcast networks and were laying concrete on a $24 million resort called the Havana Monte Carlo. Frank Sinatra was supposed to be the face of it. Then came Castro. By 1958, it was chaos. Mobsters who had funded the Batista regime started hedging bets. Arms deals to the rebels suddenly became attractive. Marcello, the former president, was knee-deep in arms shipments. In 1957 and 1958, figures like Norman Rothman of the Sans Souci Casino were caught running stolen National Guard weapons from Ohio to Pittsburgh. Sam Manarino was part of that pipeline. Carlos Marcello, New Orleans boss, was allegedly in the mix too. The gear was headed to Castro. Frank Fiorini, who would later change his name to Frank Sturgis and break into the Watergate complex, played middleman. In 1958, he told anyone who'd listen that he was buying arms for Castro, stuffing them into used cars and shipping them from Miami. One arrest netted 250 guns and 50,000 rounds of ammo. He claimed he even offered Castro $100,000 to release kidnapped Americans, allegedly on behalf of Vice President Richard Nixon. Then there was Pedro Diaz-Lance, Castro's future Air Force chief, and Fiorini's partner in crime. They flew to California, Arizona, and Venezuela on a weapons hunt. Caught in Mexico with a C-46 cargo plane and a haul of arms, they were arrested, and then released after a friendly chat with the CIA. Marcello was also backing Robert Ray McKeown, a Houston smuggler with a daughter allegedly dating the former president. McKeown used Marcello's cash to buy a Texas safe house and arm up Jorge Sotos and the 26th of July movement. The feds indicted them all in 1958. McKeown pled out, got a suspended sentence, and claimed Marcello promised him half of the Seville Biltmore Hotel. That same year, Batista turned to an American PR fixer, Irving Davidson. Davidson was connected to Jimmy Hoffa, sold Israeli weapons to Nicaragua, and claimed he could get anyone anything. His client list included foreign governments and the Teamsters Pension Fund. In 1958, he secured a $260,000 letter of credit from the Cuban government to buy Israeli arms. The FBI took notice. Meanwhile, Dominic Bartone, another Hoffa-linked arms dealer from Ohio, tried to broker the sale of 11 U.S. military cargo planes to Batista. He set up a company, Acros Dynamics, and tried to get Teamsters financing. The deal collapsed when Batista fell. The mob, always playing both sides, didn't just bet on Batista. They priced Castro's head at $5 million. Batista's fall came fast. He suspended constitutional protections in March '58, staged a sham election in November, and then watched as Castro kidnapped 50 Americans to flex his new power. Sturgis claimed he tried to ransom them for Nixon. Who knows if that was true? What is true is this. By the time the dust settled in Havana, the alliances were made, the resentments hardened, and the cast of characters that would one day walk the road to Dallas had already picked their side. By late 1958, Earl Smith, U.S. ambassador to Cuba, had seen enough. To him, Castro was a communist, plain and simple. But back in Washington, the government wasn't ready to call it. They were still arresting arms smugglers, helping the rebels, still stuck without a real plan. Batista was crumbling, and the clock was ticking. Then came William Pawley. Pawley wasn't just some concerned citizen. He was a Cold War freelancer, part businessman, part spook, with diplomatic credentials and a history of knowing the right people. Born in South Carolina in 1896, he grew up partly in Cuba and had built a career in aviation from China to India. Back in the early 40s, Pawley helped launch the Flying Tigers, a volunteer air force Roosevelt had assembled for Chiang Kai-shek. He made a nice commission on the deal, $250,000 on 100 P-40S sold to the cause. General Claire Chennault, the Tigers' commander, later told federal investigators that Pawley had tried to bribe him. It didn't matter. Truman made him ambassador to Peru in 1945 and Brazil in 1946. By the end of the decade, Pawley had found new enemies. He'd joined Time Life mogul Henry Luce in blaming U.S. diplomats for losing China to the Reds. He had it out for Foreign Service officers who, in his view, were too soft on communism, especially in Latin America. Spruiler Braden was one of them. Pawley made him a target. Despite a few black marks, including being flagged for dishonesty, Pawley worked with the CIA twice in the early 50s. In 1954, he even landed on the Doolittle Committee, a Cold War think tank handpicked by the agency. That same year he claimed, later, that he played a behind-the-scenes role in the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. He was close to Batista too. Knew him for 30 years. By the 50s, Pawley owned Havana's streetcar system and had his hands in business across the Caribbean, including the Dominican Republic. He was tight with Eisenhower, friendly with Allen Dulles. So, in November 1958, they sent him to Cuba on a shadow mission, convinced Batista to step down and let a junta of moderate military officers take over. Pawley brought along the CIA's Havana station chief and L.C. King, the agency's top man for Latin America. Batista told them to forget it. 3 weeks later, he was gone. December 31st, 1958, he got on a plane and left the island. Antonio Varona, a Batista ally, came back to Cuba to try and organize a last-minute third force alternative. It failed. According to Cuban intel officer turned historian Fabian Escalante, David Atlee Phillips, then a CIA contract agent in Havana, had been trying to pull off something similar. The American business class in Cuba watched Castro roll in like a storm, and they didn't like what they saw. But some Americans didn't run. Some stuck around. Some saw opportunity. One of them was Frank Sturgis. By 1959, he'd gone back to his real name, Frank Fiorini. A former arms buyer with a checkered past, he showed up at the CIA's Santiago station, offering intelligence on Castro's government. He wanted help with legal trouble in the States, maybe save his citizenship. Langley said, "Go ahead, just don't promise him anything." In March, he told them he was working as chief of security for the Cuban Air Force and moonlighting as a gambling inspector. In April, he flew to the States, walked into FBI headquarters, and gave agents a warning. Communists were gaining ground in Cuba. He said 2 of Castro's own Air Force men, Pedro and Mario Diaz-Lance, felt the same. Meanwhile, in California, another ex-serviceman was watching things closely. Lee Harvey Oswald was still in the Marines. He'd just come back from the Far East in late '58 and was stationed at El Toro. He talked with another Marine, Luis Delgado, about going to Cuba once they got out. Maybe train rebel fighters in Latin America. Delgado later told the Warren Commission that Oswald visited the Cuban consulate in Los Angeles, said he got mail from them, even claimed someone from the consulate came out to El Toro to see him. But when Oswald got his discharge in September, he didn't go south. He went east, Europe, then on to Moscow. He had something else in mind. Still, 3 men with ties to Kennedy's murder would pass through Cuba in '59. Lauren Eugene Hall was one. He would later surface in the Odio incident, knocking on a door in Dallas with Oswald in tow. But 10 years earlier, Hall was spiraling. After army service in Germany, he bounced around Wichita with a rap sheet, a broken marriage, and a stint as a police informant. He cracked in '57, spent 6 months in a VA psych ward, then vanished. He resurfaced in Cuba. He got there in March, got introduced to Frank Sturgis, and landed a gig training troops for an attempted coup in Nicaragua. The Somoza brothers were the target. Just the kind of job Oswald had fantasized about. Hall didn't last long. His Cuban handlers suspected he was working for the Americans. He got arrested and sat in a cell for 3 months. But before he was released in July and shipped back to the US, he met someone important at the detention camp. Santo Trafficante. Trafficante wasn't just another mobster. He was Meyer Lansky's man in Havana, running or skimming from 5 different hotels and casinos: the Sans Souci, the Comodoro, the St. John, the Deauville, and the Capri. He'd fled New York to dodge a subpoena related to the 1957 murder of Albert Anastasia, and was laying low from questions about the Appalachian Summit, which had gotten 20 mobsters convicted for obstruction of justice in early 1960. Trafficante thought he'd survive Castro like he had Batista and the governments before that. He'd played both sides before, helped Castro early on, thought he could renegotiate, grease the right palms. He miscalculated. To Castro's revolutionaries, the mob-run casinos weren't just dens of vice. They were symbols of everything Batista stood for. The days of compromise were over. January 1st, 1959. The revolutionaries didn't waste time. As Castro's men rolled into Havana, they trashed the casinos, symbols of the old regime. Gambling was outlawed on the spot. Castro reopened the houses briefly in February to soften the blow on workers, but Trafficante got the message. His days at the Sans Souci were numbered. Castro wasn't playing games. He told Trafficante directly, "You're done here." The mobsters linked to Batista's brother-in-law, Roberto Fernandez Miranda, was enough to make him toxic. Trafficante tried a trick. He staged a fake sale of the Sans Souci to Eufemio Fernandez Ortega, a former secret police chief under President Prio. Castro wasn't fooled. On April 13th, the Sans Souci was shut down. Trafficante still didn't get the hint. He tried to stay under the radar. Then, on May 6th, the hammer dropped. Jake Lansky and Dino Cellini, fellow mob-connected casino men, got popped for drug trafficking. Trafficante vanished. A month later, one of his guys was caught offering a $4,000 bribe to a top Cuban cop to call off the manhunt. Meanwhile, his associate John Martino wasn't so lucky. Martino had been on the FBI's radar since the '30s, gambling, bootlegging, extortion, maybe even kidnapping. He moved from Atlantic City to Miami, deep into the local gambling scene. By the mid-'50s, he was supplying security and rigged equipment to Havana casinos. This was a guy who could stop a roulette wheel on command and had a system to get horse race results to bookies before the track could. After Castro took over, Martino flew to Havana in January. He made 6 trips back and forth to Miami, smuggling cash out of Cuba. In July, he pushed it too far. He flew in with his 12-year-old son and got nailed for trying to sneak anti-Castro operatives out of the country. A Cuban doctor treating Martino told the FBI the guy was tight with Trafficante and had deep ties to Batista loyalists like Rolando Masferra. Martino even offered the doctor a gig as house physician at a brothel he planned to open. He didn't go to trial until December. Meanwhile, Trafficante was still working his angles. He made contact with Americans inside Castro's army, maybe Frank Sturgis, maybe soldier of fortune William Morgan. On June 9th, Trafficante was arrested, but he wasn't tossed in a cell. He was sent to Trescornia, a holding facility for immigrants. He had his own food, his own wine, and all the time he needed to work on getting out. One of his cellmates? Loran Hall. That marked the beginning of a 2-decade relationship between the mobster and the ex-soldier turned operative. Then came the visit that changed everything. Jack Ruby showed up. At the time, Ruby was still scraping by in Dallas, running the Vegas Club. His partner, Joe Bonds, was already behind bars for sodomy and white slavery. Ruby had a rap sheet of his own. Liquor violations, fights in his club, but no major convictions. He was a hustler. He kept cops close by hiring them as bouncers and offering free drinks. He lived broke, borrowed small amounts, $1,000 here, $3,000 there, put up his car as collateral. He was always chasing a score. An invention, a rising performer, or in this case, guns. In early 1959, Ruby tried to break into the Cuban arms trade. He tracked down Robert Ray McKeown, a former gun runner facing sentencing in Houston, now operating a drive-in near Seabrook with money from Prio. A sheriff came by one day with a message. Someone needed McKeown urgently. A man called soon after, identifying himself as Rubinstein. He said he wanted to ransom 3 prisoners from Castro's jails, $5,000 apiece, backed by Las Vegas money. McKeown asked for the cash up front. Rubinstein promised it, never delivered. A few weeks later, a man McKeown believed was Ruby showed up again, offering a new deal: sell Castro a batch of Jeeps out of Shreveport. McKeown asked $5,000 for a letter of introduction. Again, Ruby disappeared. They all confirmed the story: Ruby McKeown, the sheriff. In a 1978 deposition, McKeown hinted at deeper connections. Asked about Dallas mobsters Joe and Sam Campisi, Ruby knew them well. McKeown said Prio had named them as allies of the cause. The Jeep scheme went nowhere. But Ruby had learned something important. There were still high-level Americans trapped in Cuba, and they were desperate. In March, Ruby reached out to the FBI. He met with agents 8 times between March and October, offering to be a source. He gave them nothing useful, but the timing was suspicious. Mob guys often open a line to law enforcement when they're about to take a big risk. Ruby told them nothing about Cuba, but it was clearly on his mind. That summer, Ruby may have made contact with Pedro and Martin Fox, Cuban owners of Havana's Tropicana Club. His old pal Louis McWillie worked there, part of the same gambling circuit. Ruby later said he'd had dinner with one of the Fox brothers and 2 Dallas lawyers with mob ties, David McCord and Alfred E. McLean. The Foxes were in town to collect a gambling debt. But the talk may have turned to arms, arrests, or payoffs. In May, a woman named Elaine Miner flew to Havana. She knew Ruby from her job at National Car Rental in Dallas. He gave her a message for McWillie, coded but clear. He was coming. "He's crazy," McWillie said when he got the note. 6 weeks later, on July 1st, Ruby rented a safe deposit box in Dallas. He visited it often in the coming months. He never explained why. But he went to Havana. A Cuban tourist card showed he arrived August 8th. He stayed for 10 days and visited Traficante, still locked up at Trescornia, multiple times. The CIA got word of it from a British journalist named Jonathan Hudson, who'd been arrested in the same sweep that netted Hall. He remembered Luis Santos, one of Traficante's aliases, getting the VIP treatment and regular visits from an American gangster type named Ruby. Traficante was released on August 18th, 10 days after Ruby arrived. Ruby made it out too somehow. By August 21st, he was back in Dallas, hitting the safe deposit box again. He met with the FBI on August 31st and never mentioned Cuba. He was back at the box on September 4th. Then he vanished again. A group from Chicago recalled seeing Ruby at the Tropicana that Labor Day weekend. On September 11th, Ruby was in Miami, meeting with Meyer Panitz, a gambling associate from Dallas. He flew back to Havana on the 12th, then to New Orleans on the 13th. It looks like Ruby, like Martino, was smuggling money out. But unlike Martino, who got 13 years in December for trying to sneak a Nazi war criminal off the island, Ruby skated. While casino men scrambled to escape with whatever they could carry, other American operators tried hedging their bets. Arcos Dynami, an Ohio outfit that once financed surplus planes for Batista, tried early in '59 to sell aircraft to Castro's new government. Dominic Bartone and his crew even flew to Havana, hoping to close a deal. But the press got wind of Teamster ties to the scheme. Jimmy Hoffa's name surfaced, and under pressure from the Senate Rackets Committee and Robert Kennedy, the Teamsters backed off, at least publicly. Years later, Edward Partin, the government's star witness against Hoffa, laid it out. The whole thing was Hoffa's way of helping his mob buddies get their money out of Cuba. They were trying to win points with Castro. By May, Bartone had switched sides. He lined up an arms deal with Batista supporters working inside the Dominican regime of General Trujillo. On May 22nd, Bartone and several others were arrested in Miami, caught trying to fly a plane load of weapons to the Dominican Republic. The charges: bribery, conspiracy, illegal arms export. And in July, as all this unfolded, journalist William Atwood made yet another visit to Cuba. William Atwood was no stranger to revolution. Foreign correspondent, editor of Look magazine. He'd interviewed Castro both before and after the takeover. Later, he'd serve as Kennedy's ambassador to Guinea. But in the summer of '59, Atwood found himself at a cocktail party in Havana that felt more like a planning session for a hit. The crowd was wealthy, the house elegant, and the Americans, they weren't shy. "There's a contract out on Castro," one of them said. Atwood was even introduced to two men who'd supposedly been tapped to carry it out. "It actually dumbfounded me," he recalled. Julio Lobo, Cuban sugar king, banker and multimillionaire, told Atwood point blank, Castro wouldn't make it to the end of the year. Other guests said the Americans were CIA. Atwood had stumbled into something real. The plot likely involved Batista loyalists holed up in the Dominican Republic, mob-connected Americans, and a wild card named William Morgan. Morgan had fought for Castro, but was now playing both sides, or all three. Bartone, the arms dealer, was in touch with him by May. By July 30th, an informant in Havana told the FBI that Morgan had accepted $200,000 from the Dominican Consul General, with Bartone standing right there. The whispers? Morgan was going to take Castro out, and an invasion would follow. 2 decades later, the story came full circle. Edward Browder, a former arms trafficker and convicted securities swindler, told the House Select Committee on Assassinations the exact same thing. Morgan, he said, was supposed to kill Castro at Coima, a beachfront resort the Cuban leader loved. The CIA had even handed him the weapons. But Morgan flipped. He gave the guns and the money to Castro. Word of the Dominican-backed invasion reached FB1 headquarters by early May. Among the sources, ex-Cuban police chief Manuel Benitez and lobbyist Irving Davidson. Davidson met with the Bureau's assistant director, August Belmont, on June 30th, acting on behalf of Lobo. He floated a veiled threat. If the US didn't back his new anti-communist group, CRAC, they might have no choice but to throw in with the Dominican invasion. On August 13th, the invasion collapsed. Morgan and Eloy Gutierrez Menoyo, both seen as Castro loyalists, had betrayed the plot. Thousands of would-be conspirators inside Cuba were arrested. The first serious attempt to overthrow Castro ended in disaster. Morgan, unstable, dangerous, and unpredictable, kept shifting loyalties until November, when Cuban police grabbed him for organizing guerrilla resistance. He was executed in 1960. In Washington, it took time for the scales to fall. At first, Castro's mass executions of Batistianos caused alarm. On February 12th, CIA Director Allen Dulles warned the National Security Council that Castro wanted to ignite revolutions across Latin America. But when Castro visited the US in April, Vice President Nixon met with him, liked what he saw, and urged patience. Nixon saw a natural leader of men, someone America might still steer in the right direction. Then came the May Day parade, and worse, the Agrarian Reform Law on May 17th, essentially a death sentence for US-owned sugar lands. Behind the scenes, panic grew. That same month, the State Department sent a telegram to all Latin American embassies. Batista loyalists might be planning an invasion out of the Dominican Republic. On the ground, American intelligence agents were already acting like the war had started. The agrarian reforms, plus the sudden rise of Raúl Castro and Che Guevara, triggered the formation of a homegrown opposition in Cuba. Former guerrillas like Hugo Matos, Humberto Sorí Marín, and Manuel Artimé joined up with old-school auténticos like Prio and Varona. The CIA kept contact through Bernard Barker, a former Batista intelligence officer who, years later, would make headlines as a Watergate burglar. By September, Artimé proposed sparking a rebellion to justify US intervention. It never got off the ground. Within weeks, Matos was arrested. Artimé fled the country. And Frank Sturgis? He said he was in from the start. In 1975, he told both the Rockefeller Commission and the New York Daily News that Park E. Woolham, a CIA man in Santiago de Cuba, recruited him just before Castro took over. Sturgis said he worked directly with Colonel Nikos, the US military attaché in Havana, someone he believed was also linked to the agency. The CIA opened Sturgis's file in 1958 when they caught wind of his arms trafficking. On January 6, 1959, Sturgis offered his services to the CIA in Santiago. He was worried he'd lose his US citizenship if he kept dealing with Castro. Headquarters replied, "Proceed with caution, no commitments, no promises." Sturgis claimed he started recruiting agents right away and was already involved in assassination plots by February. He said he told Nikos. The colonel told him to stand down. He also said he helped arrange the escape of himself and Pedro Diaz-Lance, Castro's Air Force commander. Diaz-Lance flew to the US on July 1st, testified before the Senate, and started dropping propaganda leaflets over Havana. Sturgis made it out the following year. The CIA isn't talking. In the 201 file they released to the Assassination Records Review Board, there's a black hole. No documents between January 13th, 1959, when HQ greenlit limited use of Sturgis as a source, and January 10th, 1961. When the Miami station finally filed a report, it sounded like they didn't even know he'd been working for them. So, either Sturgis had a second file under another name, or the original was never fully released. Back in Washington, the policy shift finally hit. In October 1959, after yet another blistering anti-American speech from Castro, the State Department called it, regime change was the only path forward. They'd try to play it off, no overt pressure, no obvious intervention, but the gloves were off. Secretary of State Christian Herter passed the recommendation to President Eisenhower. The State Department also tried to rein in freelance raids by Cuban exiles. By December, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, pushed hard by Admiral Arleigh Burke, were calling for a full invasion plan. The Eisenhower doctrine was now fully engaged. Stop communism in Latin America, whatever it takes. Roosevelt's old good neighbor policy from the 1930s? It was dead and buried. In the Rio Treaty of 1947 and the 1948 Charter of the Organization of American States, the US and its Latin American neighbors made a show of unity. non-intervention in each other's internal affairs. But by the early 1950s, the ink was already drying on a new reality: contain communism, even if it meant breaking the rules. The Truman administration couldn't square the principle with the threat. They tried to live with Guatemala's left-leaning government after Jacobo Arbenz was elected in 1950, even when he nationalized property owned by the United Fruit Company. But Eisenhower wasn't interested in coexistence. Within a year of taking office, he decided Arbenz was compromised, another domino tipping toward Moscow. With the OAS unwilling to back a takedown, Eisenhower went covert. The CIA under Allen Dulles had just pulled off a coup in Iran. In 1954, they did it again in Guatemala. A small force of 200 men, backed by CIA-directed airstrikes, crossed in from Honduras. The Guatemalan military cracked, and Arbenz was finished. The agency liked what it saw. They kept pushing. Cambodia, Laos, Tibet, Sumatra, mostly failures. But the CIA had become the go-to arm for dealing with third world regimes. Castro was next. On December 12, 1959, J.C. King, chief of the CIA's Western Hemisphere Division, sent a memo to Dulles warning that Castro, left unchecked, would become a regional menace. Thorough consideration, he wrote, should be given to Castro's elimination. Someone scrawled in the margin, removal from Cuba. Like that made it better. Within weeks, King was floating a plan to make Castro's beard fall out using chemicals. Absurd, but the message was clear. Anything was on the table. King was already working to unite the Cuban exile factions. William Paulley was back in the picture. The failed fixer from Batista's final days was now wired into everything: Trujillo, crack, Julio Lobo's network, and a ring of Batista loyalists. In October, he invited the CIA to bug his Miami office. He wanted them to hear the action firsthand. Paulley had juice. He was close to Dulles. He was even tighter with Nixon. On January 9, 1960, he sat down for a long lunch with the vice president. Nixon saw him as an advisor. Paulley brought a gift, a watch, and left with even more influence. Nixon suggested Eisenhower join him at his Virginia farm for some weekend hunting. Paulley extended the invite. 5 days later, on January 14th, the National Security Council met. State Department official Livingston Merchant explained that they were already working with the CIA to build opposition inside Cuba. Nixon said Latin America was better prepared for a Cuban crisis than it had been for Guatemala. Eisenhower sounded more cautious. On January 22nd, he reaffirmed the OAS non-intervention pledge publicly and claimed the US was taking steps to prevent exile-led attacks from American soil. But behind the scenes, things were moving fast. On February 15th, Paulley met with Eisenhower for an hour. The president trusted his gut on Latin America. 2 days later, Eisenhower told NSC staffers Gordon Gray and General Goodpaster he was frustrated the Cuba plans were too narrow. Why weren't they thinking bigger, even drastic? 5 days after that, Paulley told a CIA contact that a Florida GOP boss had promised millions, $20 or $200, he wasn't sure, for Cuban exiles to take down Castro, allegedly on Nixon's behalf. No proof. But the whisper stuck. Then Eisenhower left for South America. He saw the poverty. He saw the rage. He heard the cheers, but he also saw the resistance. Nobody wanted a US-backed operation in Cuba. So publicly, he stuck to the script: non-intervention, democracy, freedom. Behind closed doors, the gloves were already off. By March 1960, Castro had nationalized US businesses and started shopping for Soviet weapons, the exact playbook Arbenz had used. The CIA got the green light. That spring, the Special Group, also known as the 5412 Committee, put forward a formal covert action plan. Their goal was crystal clear: overthrow Castro and install a regime acceptable to the US. without leaving fingerprints. The operation would run on 2 tracks: exile leadership abroad, covert teams inside Cuba. They would build a propaganda pipeline, recruit defectors, infiltrate agents, and create a guerrilla force, trained outside the US but backed by it. On paper, the cost was $4.4 million. In reality, it would be far more. To front the operation, the CIA used a ruse: American businessmen who cared about Cuba. In truth, they were agency officers. The exiles weren't fooled. Eisenhower gave his approval in a March 17th meeting. His only instruction? Everyone involved had to be ready to swear they'd never heard of it. What came next was murky. On March 4th, 1960, the French ship La Coubre, loaded with arms, exploded in Havana harbor. 2 blasts killed 81 people. Castro blamed the US. No proof ever surfaced, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The fuse was now lit. The CIA operation evolved fast. Richard Bissell, the agency's deputy director for plans, stayed at the top, but let his covert action chief, Tracy Barnes, take on more responsibility. J.C. King jumped in and out. Coordination was a mess. Bissell and King tripped over each other. The Havana and Miami stations were in competition. So were their agents. In January 1960, a new division was born: Western Hemisphere Branch 4, WH/4. Led by J.D. Esterline, it started small, just 18 headquarters staff and 22 field agents in Cuba. By April 1961, it had ballooned to nearly 600 people. Most didn't speak Spanish. Many were washouts from other CIA departments. The quality problem was systemic. Miami Station, later codenamed JMWAVE, started training a few hundred Cubans in counterintelligence in July. They were building what they hoped would be post-Castro security forces. That early cohort included Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, and Felix Rodriguez, names that would echo through Watergate and Iran-Contra. Politically, the CIA decided, on paper, not to back anyone connected to Batista. But they looked the other way when Paoli did just that. In May 1960, the CIA helped form the Frente Revolucionario Democrático, FRD. Antonio Varona was the face of it. Other players included his fellow Auténtico, Aureliano Sánchez Arango, and 3 defectors from Castro's revolution: Manuel Artime of the MRR, Juan Antonio Rasco of the MDC, and Manuel Rey of the MRP. This was the skeleton of the future Bay of Pigs Brigade. It was CIA's first big swing at Castro, and it wouldn't be their last. The men leading Cuba's exile movements in 1960 would remain front and center for the next 4 years. But not without friction. Manuel Rey, a former Castro official, pushed for Fidelismo sin Fidel, Castroism without Castro, which put him at odds with the more conservative exile factions almost immediately. By March 1961, William Pauli was already complaining to the State Department that Rey was cozying up to the Soviets and needed to be sidelined. The exile movement split in 2 camps: ex-Castro reformers and old-school Batistianos. That divide would dog the Kennedy administration from day one. The FRD's first CIA case officer was Gerald Droller, a German leftist using the alias Frank Bender. When things got too ideological, the agency replaced him with someone more in line with their goals: E. Howard Hunt, a hardliner who would one day become infamous for Watergate. The FRD collapsed in November 1960, but was reborn just months later as the Cuban Revolutionary Council, CRC, now fronted by José Miró Cardona, a high-profile defector. But the cracks were already showing. Neither Eisenhower nor Kennedy could afford to look like they were reinstalling Batista, but their support for more left-leaning defectors irritated the right-wing exiles and their American backers. Militarily, the CIA expanded fast. They opened bases in Florida, Louisiana, Puerto Rico, Panama, Nicaragua, and most critically, Guatemala. Though they'd planned a paramilitary build-up as early as December 1959, the main base in Guatemala wasn't operational until late October 1960. US Special Forces didn't arrive until January 1961. By then, 644 men were in training. That number would more than double. The Exile Army got a name, Brigade 2506. Manuel Artime was in command. The agency wasn't naive. They knew the brigade couldn't topple Castro alone. But the Guatemalan base quickly became the CIA's focal point. Still, the relationship between Americans and Cubans was rocky. The trainers saw the exiles as amateurs. Political leaders from the CRC were kept away from the camps until right before the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Cubans began to see the operation not as theirs, but as Washington's. Inside Cuba, resistance movements were still operating in 1960. Thousands of young men were fleeing the island for Miami, but many stayed behind and fought. The CIA's Directorate of Plans wasn't built for mass mobilization. They were spooks, not organizers. They knew how to run a spy ring, not raise an army. While the agency spent months stitching together the CRC and FRD, they refused to let Cuban leaders exert control over the 1,500 men preparing to invade. The Cubans felt ignored. After the Bay of Pigs, they felt betrayed. Cuban opposition groups began acting on their own. In September 1960, the CIA learned of a new organization, Movimiento Insurreccional de Recuperación Revolucionaria, MIRR, led by two ex-Castro fighters, Orlando Bosch and Victor Paneque Batista, aka Comandante Diego. Bosch had once led the 26th of July movement in a Cuban province. Paneque had been a top cop under Castro. Now they were out for blood. Paneque distrusted the FRD. The CIA was in such a hurry to get married, it picked the wrong girl, he said. He formed loose alliances with Artime's MRR and other exile groups, and talked openly about infiltrating 90 fighters into the Escambray Mountains. The CIA didn't trust Paneque. Some thought he was still working for Castro. But he got his hands on enough money to buy weapons for 100 men in the US. By year's end, Bosch and Paneque were getting recruitment help from two Americans, Frank Sturgis, back from his Cuban adventures, and Alex Rourke, a journalist with agency ties and friends in high places, including Eisenhower himself. The FBI told the CIA it was investigating Sturgis for violating the Neutrality Act. The CIA played it safely. They said they didn't have an interest in MIRR yet. Bosch kept running trips into Cuba in early 1961, but Castro's militia crushed the guerrilla cells in the Escambray that March. Bosch blamed Verona and the FRD for failing to airdrop supplies. Meanwhile, the CIA had its eye on another group, the revived Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, DRE. This was no fringe outfit. The original Directorio had helped Castro rise, but by 1960, one of its leaders, Rolando Cubela, had flipped and was purging anti-communist students. Two former leaders, Alberto Muller and Manuel Salvat Roque, fled to the US in June. The CIA helped them rebuild the DRE in Miami. Salvat handled propaganda. Muller ran the show. They tried to spark radio station attacks, student strikes, sabotage, but the agency only saw them as PR tools. The CIA infiltrated Muller and Salvat back into Cuba, but only Muller stayed. Salvat made it out via Guantanamo. Muller stayed behind. He'd resurface in a very different place, in New Orleans in 1963, confronting Lee Harvey Oswald. Back in 1960, the Castro-US relationship was circling the drain. In May, Castro demanded American and British refineries process Soviet oil. When they refused, he nationalized them. Eisenhower retaliated, cancelled Cuba's sugar quota. Khrushchev filled the gap and added a vague but clear threat: missiles. In August, Castro seized more American property and went to New York to meet Khrushchev in person at the United Nations. Eisenhower's last big statement came August 24th. He said the US had tried to stay out of Cuban politics and didn't see the situation as hopeless. Kennedy and Nixon didn't share his optimism. On the campaign trail, Kennedy hammered Eisenhower for losing Cuba to the communists. In the fourth televised debate, he called for arming and supporting exiles. He knew many of the weapons Castro had used to oust Batista came from the US. Nixon warned that Kennedy's approach would provoke the Soviets and alienate the OAS. But his suggestion that Castro be isolated like Arbenz was laced with irony. Arbenz had been brought down by the CIA. By late November, the training camp in Guatemala was no longer a secret. On November 29th, Eisenhower held one final high-level meeting on Cuba. He insisted the training should continue as long as it wasn't too obvious who was behind it. Pauli had just spent another 45 minutes with the president. He wanted Artemay purged, claiming he was a communist. Pauli wanted control of the brigade. Eisenhower called him a zealot, but didn't rule it out. Allen Dulles and the cabinet pushed back. On December 8th, the CIA pitched its invasion plan to the special group. Preliminary airstrikes launched from Nicaragua, then a beach landing by exiles, meant to spark a mass uprising. The group gave the green light. But on January 15th, just before Kennedy took office, the CIA quietly admitted that the invasion force probably couldn't hold its ground without US military backup. Eisenhower told Kennedy the plan was going well and that he had a responsibility to make it succeed, whatever is necessary. By then, coexistence with Castro was off the table. In early December, the US Embassy in Havana, out of the loop on the coming invasion, recommended that the US break diplomatic ties. The embassy argued it would be better to do it on their terms, but Washington moved too slowly. On January 2nd, 1961, the Cuban government demanded both embassies be cut to 11 personnel. The next day, a White House meeting sealed the deal. The US broke relations. Eisenhower also ordered the Cuban guerrilla force increased to 1,500 men. By now, the exile war was an open secret. But one part of the operation remained locked down tight: the plan to kill Fidel Castro. The CIA wanted more than regime change. They wanted assassination: quiet, deniable, final. By mid-1960, they had handpicked their hitmen: John Roselli from LA, Sam Giancana from Chicago, and Santo Traficante, Cuba's kingpin, now back in Miami. Organized crime was now on the US government payroll, and the operation was just getting started.